Hi, I'm Danny Kruge. Today I'm going to be doing a presentation called WTF, What the Fabric. I've actually done this presentation a few times around conferences in the Balkan region, but I want to be able to share it online. So now we're doing a live recording with an audience as well. So, I introduced myself partially. I'm Danny Kruge. I'm a mission-critical engineer working for a company called Schuberg Phillips. Originally, I was a SQL DBA turned mission-critical engineer, but there was a bit of history before that. So how did I even get to being a mission-critical engineer? I actually worked first-line IT support for a retail store called Next. I was actually classed there as new and developing for a while. So for the first 6 months, I was new and developing, but I was training the whole department. I was writing documentation for the whole team, but still classed as new and developing. I spent more time in the office actually being told off than I was actually doing my work. I needed more, let's say, stimulation and more work. So when I was looking for more roles to do there, I studied for a CCNA. So I was more certified than most of the network engineers, and we're talking about a 4,000 people company. So they thought, okay, if this guy can learn his CCNA and do networking, why can't he learn SQL? So I became a SQL DBA. I was a junior SQL DBA there. After 2 years, I wanted something more. I wanted to be classed as like a senior DBA. So I actually met some Dutch guys when traveling in Bali, and they were from Amsterdam. So, yeah, if you like it here so much in Amsterdam, why don't you live here? So I found a company called Arbelli, who were also offering a SQL DBA role. I got the job. I moved to Amsterdam, and I was only planning to be there for the summer. And next minute, I know one of the engineers who actually worked there was like, yeah, it's a sticky place, Amsterdam. And yeah, 8 years later, I'm still living in the Netherlands. 4 years after Arbelli, so I was 4 years at Arbelli. 2 years, it was quite a small infrastructure. After 2 years, there was a lot of fixes I'd done, and you'd turn up for work, you'd check the monitoring system, and everything was fine. So I wanted something more than, it would be nice if I was, at a very old age, looking for retirement. It's quite a comfortable job. But I wanted something more, and Schuberg came knocking on my door, and it's a candy store. They have a lot of customers, so you can switch teams, etc. And it's amazing the freedom I get that I can do in my job role now. Okay, that's how I got to being a mission-critical engineer. Now I'm also Azure Heroes organizer, Dutch Cloud Meetup organizer, and I actually have 2 kids, and I live in Aladdin in the Netherlands. Anyway, enough about me. Today, we'll be learning about Microsoft Fabric. So there's a lot to learn, and I'm going to give a big overview about it. But first, this is the content we'll be going through today. A bit of a history lesson. What is Fabric? How it differs from infrastructure as a service to the platform as a service offerings that were already in place. How to connect migration capacities, and a bit of a demo. So, the history lesson. So I've worked with many different systems, from on-prem to Azure SQL to Data Factory. I think it's important to know how these products evolve. So it actually came from SQL Server Parallel Data Warehouse. That was an on-prem solution, which I actually had never heard of. This was a first for me, so I only found out about this in the last 6 months when actually preparing this presentation. But what you see in the slide is that it consists of quite a lot of infrastructure to actually put into place. So not many customers adopted this. And it lasted a long time. It went on until 2021. So, and what you needed to do, in 2016, Microsoft released Azure Data Warehouse. So this was like, they provided then the infrastructure for you. So it was the next level up. But you had to migrate to it. It wasn't like a lift and shift solution. There was quite a lot of migration steps needed. After that, between 2016 and 2019, they then released Synapse at 2019. Synapse was like the holy grail supposed to be. You're supposed to go from Azure Data Factory to Synapse. I'm not a fan. There is some use cases, but the problem is, and I'll go through some of these in the talk later as well, with ADF, there was features in that which weren't included in Synapse, and I'll go through a couple of those later on. But you also had to migrate from Azure Data Warehouse to Synapse. Also, it wasn't like a straight swap. And then again, 2023, Fabric comes along, and Synapse is integrated into Fabric. So then it's like another solution again, and you also have to migrate to it. So what could be next after that? I don't know, but you see a trend. Anyway, what is Fabric? There's a lot of different components in there. You have the real-time analytics, BI, data science, data. It's like an equivalent of Databricks or Snowflake. It's Microsoft's version of a data platform as a service, let's say. So I want to go into the details about them because these are all different like common terms you'll hear, which is in this picture, but there's a lot that goes into it. So I try to list them out because these names, when you just read them, it gets confusing about what the different capabilities they have. So with ADF, that's like the ETL orchestration. It's been around quite some time. You have Synapse data engineering, that's like for your Spark processing, your like a Python code you want to run in a notebook, let's say. Data science equivalent, you have ML capabilities. I'm not an ML expert, sort of machine learning, so don't ask me any questions about that. For SQL, yes, so when it comes to the data warehousing, SQL capabilities, fire away. Synapse real-time analytics, KQL, and event streams, that's a new one, which has been introduced into Fabric. It didn't exist in the actual Synapse PaaS solution. Power BI, I think most people would know. That's the reporting part. It's a mature product, been around for a long time. Data Activator is also a new one. If you don't really know how that works, it basically does like a monitoring of your data itself. So if you have a refrigeration unit, which is having to run at a temperature of like 4 degrees, if that goes up to 10 degrees, let's say, the products in there, in that refrigerator, they're not going to be so good. So you want to know if that actually happens, so you can actually act upon that, and you can do workflows after. It's still in preview, so currently, but it's got a lot of potential, I have to say. Then, databases. I guess when I did this presentation first time, this was quite new, but then it's been released as public preview in Ignite. So a lot of you have now heard about SQL databases being integrated there, but it was quite funny. When I was doing this presentation, the day before I did it at one NTK in Slovenia, it was actually just appeared the day before I did this presentation. So I was like, okay, what is this? I didn't get an email about my private preview that I was introduced into. So that was quite an interesting one then, trying to explain to people, oh yeah, well, databases could be appearing. But now, yeah, it's quite cool. They've integrated that in there, so you've got a lot more capabilities with inside of Fabric. And this is a bit more about it, so how a SaaS database is being introduced. So it's a next equivalent along of the Azure SQL databases products. So I'm talking about Fabric itself, but with the data solutions out there, there's a lot to choose from. And I always make this joke in all my slides that I try and do minimalistic slides. Because I want to be narrating over the slides, not that you're concentrating on all the words on the slides. But I like to throw a big one out there like this. These are all the data products out there. So there's a lot to choose from. So Fabric is just one of many, and there's a ton out there. And before I blind you all, I won't keep the screen on there too long because there's a lot of information. What I like what they've done with Microsoft Fabric, they do have a differences page. So if you're looking to migrate from Data Factory or Synapse, you can actually look to see a table form of what the differences are. And some of the main points I've put down of what stand out to me. So yeah, you have fully SaaS. One of the points I was making earlier, ADF, so there's alerts missing. In Azure Data Factory, you can actually say if a pipeline has failed, you can it triggers an alert, and it can be like an SMS, an email, or so on. Synapse didn't have that, which was really annoying for me, so you had to kind of like do it yourself. You had to get another task in a pipeline to just trigger something or so on. So you had to kind of, it wasn't out of the box, which Data Factory has. Fabric follows the same, and even in Fabric, if you look at ADF, alerts goes to Data Activator. To me, that's like more of a trigger, and that's not an alert itself. That's not what I classify as an alert. So you have a different naming convention, as I put there as well. There's a different layout. It's very Power BI, how it's all laid out. On top of that, I work a lot with integration runtimes. So you have in the ADF default integration runtime, self-hosted ones. There's a whole different array, which I have a presentation about ADF itself, so I won't go too much into differences of those there, but in Fabric they use a Power BI data gateway, and for me performance is quite limited there. So yes, if you do small chunks of data, it's fine, but we had a use case once upon a time where a customer had 200 gigs of data, 60 gigs of data, 200 million rows, and we had to move that from on-prem to Power BI, and they were using a Power BI data gateway. And every 4 seconds, it would get a 16 megabyte chunk, compress it, and shoot it across the network, which after 18 hours, it still hadn't finished. So we introduced integration runtimes, and I could get the data from on-prem to Azure in 12 minutes. There's a big difference between 18 hours and 12 minutes. So there's a lot more throughput I could push through integration runtimes. If you're talking big data, yeah, it all depends on the design, but that's a limitation I already can see. It's also in OneLake, it's a Delta Parquet format, which is amazing. I will show a small demo about how you actually see the table structure. So it's very different to what you're used to if you're talking about databases or any components like that. It's stored very differently. You also have on-demand Spark clusters. So yes, if you have a data flow in Data Factory, normally it takes about 4 minutes cold, like startup time. And then the actual process will run. In Fabric, they're advertising that it's like a 1 second spin up. That's true, if you're using the shared pool. If you're not using the shared pool and you're using a private VNet, then you're going to wait for 4 minutes again. So you always look at the file, like the little small writing underneath. That's a bit of a gotcha. And I don't like to run things public. We do mission critical solutions, so it's normally quite sensitive data that we're actually designing for. Git and Terraform is in progress. That was also talked about in FabCon, I think. That was in Sweden. They announced Terraform was being more, so you can do Lakehouse and so on. It's a lot in preview, but it is coming more and more, so you can do a lot more governance there. Because especially for Schuberg, we deal with many customers. So I don't want to have to click it together for every customer that's going. We like to have it in code, and we can deploy it faster and more efficiently. CI/CD deployment is workspaces. There's news coming on that. I actually was in a meeting this week with Microsoft at the Amsterdam office, and there we had 2 MVPs talking about the way the CI/CD is going. There's a lot to come still be done there, and there's many ways to do it. So you can either do it from Azure DevOps itself, or within actual deployment pipelines. If you're used to Power BI, you can actually use deployment pipelines or a mixture of both. There's many ways to do it, so it's something to also wrap your head around which is best for you or what you're most used to. And I also mentioned before, it's organized in like a Power BI format. On top of all this, the most important information to know is if you're using a Power BI capacity, that they're being retired or deprecated, whatever term you want to use. You have to change to a Fabric capacity. That's if you're a Power BI premium user or a Power BI user. If you have a license directly to user, they're not affected. But if you have a dedicated capacity, in January 2025, which is only a month away, Fabric is, you have to change to a Fabric one. So you need to look into that. You only have about 90 days. I think there's mixed messages a bit now saying when your license is like towards the end for your capacity, then you have to migrate. So there's if you Google it, you'll see there's a bit of mixed messages. I would start preparing now anyway, because depending how many workspaces you have, it's a workspace thing. So if you have 1,000 workspaces, that's a lot of work unless you automate it. Please be aware of that. It's not long to have. Anyway, how to connect to existing data. There's a few different ways, and depending on what your use case is, there's different solutions for it. So a lot of data sources you'll probably use for like from ADF, and then you can connect to APIs. For example, I have a demo which I actually connect to like cryptocurrency APIs, and I grab the data down, which I'll go through later. But you can then copy data from all different sources using ADF. For another example, you have shortcuts. This is quite a new terminology. You have internal shortcuts and external shortcuts. Internal ones would be towards like Fabric one, anything existing there. External would be like in actual Azure or AWS itself. So you'd have an external shortcut going to an S3 bucket or a storage account, let's say. Event Hub is for like event streaming, different capabilities. So if you had a Kafka, I think you can now join it into there. There's mirroring capabilities. So if you have a SQL server, Azure SQL, you can actually mirror it into Fabric and get real-time replication in there, or asynchronous, it probably is. And that's going over a public connection. Storage accounts, you can even integrate now with private managed endpoint. So you can actually get from Fabric to a storage account using a managed identity as well, and an endpoint, so it's a secure connection across. So yeah, a gazillion ways of getting data in there, which is quite nice. If we go, before I start about this, when I moved from Azure Data Factory to Synapse, it was kind of like one or the other. There wasn't really a choice of saying, yeah, you should have Data Factory for all its core capabilities that it can do, and use Synapse for like the actual massive parallel processing that it is also good for. It was like one or the other. And Synapse didn't have everything that we needed for the Schuberg customers. So for one prime example, Azure Data Factory uses two private endpoints, one for the orchestration of the jobs and one for the data traversion. Synapse had one, and I had a ticket with Microsoft for 3 months, and they were guaranteeing me everything was private. I could see a public IP address in Synapse. So I was like, okay, no, how is there a public IP address if it's a private connection? We have an express route. It should be a internal IP address, a private IP. 3 months it took, and then they realized, yes, the orchestration of the actual jobs goes over the public internet. So yeah, okay. That's not what we told the customer, because that's not what you told us. But anywho, when it came to Fabric, and I had a Microsoft employee come to Schuberg and sat down, and we talked about Fabric, because I had a strong opinion about Synapse. So I was like, okay, now what's coming along with Fabric? What I love is that they approach me with this kind of migration approach. You use the products which are mature. Power BI is a very mature product. It's renowned, with a lot of success. So that's fine. You put a Fabric capacity there, nothing much changes for the actual Power BI capabilities, but you can start integrating other parts. So you could use shortcuts and start integrating with those and keep your existing infrastructure. So over time, you'll see this actually moves left a bit. So you could use one lake as your gold layer. This is an example of a medallion architecture. So not all examples would follow this, but you can still get the general idea that if you deem one lake as a mature model, you could adopt it as a next part along. And then to the next case. So if you look here, you've got storage accounts, like data lake storage accounts in there. You've got Databricks, you've got a data factory, but that's all the PaaS solution. You're using one lake as gold, and then you move it across. So you could actually start using Synapse components, engineering instead of Databricks, or keep using Databricks, but using the tables as one lake and having the data factory also being in there. And then you can go all out and have go wild in there. You're using all different components of Fabric. Once it's mature, that's what I'm telling customers at the moment. Yes, Fabric could be amazing in years to come or months to come, who knows? But for right now, there's a few bits too many things in preview, which we can't put in a production system. Anyway, onto capacities, because this also is different from Power BI to Fabric, and it's something to note. There was from the product team, Benny Diaga explained capacities. We went to Microsoft Office, and he explained a lot in detail. So I apologize, but I stole your slides. But this would go into detail so I can explain it to other people. Because in Power BI, you have cores. So you have 8 cores, 16 cores, 32. And you can know that if you have 16 versus 32, there's a difference in performance. With Fabric, it's not like that. You have compute units per second. So you have an F2 is like 2 compute units a second, and F64 is 64 units per second. And that's like a bundle of network, CPU, memory, all into one. They do their own little magic. But so that means an F2 and F64 is the same hardware underneath actually running it. So the same performance you get, it's just you get limited on what you can do. And they've done something smart, because you actually have, let me go one further, bursting and smoothing. I'll come back to the next one in a minute. With this, say your job's run at 4 a.m. So you're running in like an F2, for example. You only need a burst of compute in the morning. What they've done, so you have like this initial spike, they actually smooth that out over a period of time. So if this actually is running at 4 a.m. in the morning, you want to get everything running as fast as possible. You then smooth it out over X amount of minutes, and you actually use it's called future usage. Something to note, if you have a pay-as-you-go and you actually pause this and think you're going to save money and you've been using future usage, they will actually just, you still have to pay for it. They'll cut it and you'll have to say, okay, that's the usage you've used up to this, the future usage, we're going to charge you for that. Something to really note with this is this table, because if you use 10 minutes of future usage, that's fine. If you're within the 10-minute range, you can use it without throttling. After 10 minutes, between 10 minutes and 60 minutes, then user requested jobs, so like if the people who are wanting to use the Power BI reports, they get throttled from 60 to 20 seconds, so they have a delay to try and limit the amount of people trying to access reports. That can be an issue if your manager is one of the ones trying to access his report and he's getting a delay on there. And if you use over 60 minutes, so between 60 minutes and 24 hours, he starts getting rejected, or she. That might make your manager very unhappy if they're trying to get to their information that they need and they're being rejected to actually get to the report. If they go over 24 hours, then the background jobs are rejected, and then Microsoft will probably pull the plug and ask you to pay. So please know about that. You can look at this in a capacity metrics. That's something that doesn't come by default. You actually have to install it, and there's an image of here, but it's not very intuitive, if that's the way you say it. It takes some getting used to, but you can set like notifications. If I go back quickly to one of my other slides, where were we? Here. So I've been talking about capacities a lot, and something to note is this is saying like you have one capacity. You have a tenant, then you have a capacity within that tenant. There's not really a limit unless you go thousands upon thousands, and I don't know what number it goes to, but you can have a lot of capacities. With Power BI, yes, it was quite expensive to have a Power BI capacity. You're talking like 5,000 something a month, maybe more. So you would have one capacity normally. You wouldn't have one for dev, test, production. With Fabric, I think it's very important that you start to think about this in a production environment. You probably want its own capacity. So each workspace, you'd normally divide it by a dev workspace, a test workspace, for example, so you deploy from dev to test, and then they could share a capacity. Production, you'd want its own capacity. Why? You don't really want people developing and doing whatever queries they want because they're developing, hitting the production capacity, because that can impact the end user who's actually trying to view the report. And then you're getting throttled if you're over-consuming that capacity. Production should have its own capacity. And then with the different capacities of NF2, that's only like 200 something euros a month. It's a lot easier to spread this load out in that way. And I go into different capacity costs, which probably has changed since the slide I actually did, so just take it with a pinch of salt. But please note that you probably should have separate capacities along your environments, dev, test, acceptance, prod, whatever you want to do. Okay, now I did bursting and smoothing. I jumped a bit back and forth, but hey-ho, it doesn't really matter. You get the picture. What I first did a talk about Azure Data Factory, and I did a use case. And what this use case is, what I presented in a simple diagram here. I use a function app, and I go towards an API for cryptocurrency. I store it on a storage account, and Data Factory is the one doing the orchestration of this. I then put it into a SQL database where I do some simple queries upon that database, and it gets put into Power BI. How that looked in Data Factory was something like this. So I would delete all the actual files from the blob storage, I'd trigger function and do some SQL queries. And that changed in Fabric. I did the same actual setup, and I'll show you how I did it in Fabric and show you different components. So if I pray to the demo gods, we can try and see if I can get this going. So I should have my screen here. Oh, got it. So this is Microsoft Fabric as at the homepage. You see the different components in there, your databases, Data Factory, etc. What you normally would navigate from is having the little bar down here. You see it's already like Power BI, how it looks, and you can go to the different parts. So if I wanted to open up one of them, it doesn't actually matter which one you go into. I can click on any of these. So even real-time intelligence, for example, or Data Factory. I then get all these different toolbars. This has changed recently. Normally you had this part over here, and I would always click on these because to me, I would click, oh yeah, I want a data pipeline. But what I always missed was that it's create a data pipeline, and then it will go to a different bar, and oh no, I want my existing workspace. So these are all new. If I scroll down, I get to my workspace. And in my workspace is the actual where the magic happens. So you have two views. I tend to use the one I just shown, but you have like a list view. Within the list view, you have like all the different parts I have within here. You can ignore the AI skill, but there's all different components. So I normally use the actual lineage view, which is really nice because I can see where the data is coming from. So you have the web APIs, and if I click on this, you see the web APIs through the data pipeline. I have a lakehouse. I'll go into the difference between a lakehouse, warehouse, these different components in there. I have a few slides about that. So the lakehouse, I probably shouldn't have used the lakehouse in this concept, but it's quite nice that I did because there's a big difference between a lakehouse and a warehouse in the way you use SQL. So yes, you can use SQL on both, but one is you can manipulate data, one you can only read from it, which I'll go through later. But you have a SQL Analytics endpoint, so I can actually read from the lakehouse, and they're all Parquet. I have a semantic model, and that's like an auto refresh, which is really nice. So if the data changes on the lakehouse with the semantic model there, there's if the data changes, it knows that. It automatically gets the newest data and publishes it to the Power BI report. That wasn't the case in the past for Power BI. You'd have a data set, you'd have to refresh it, or you'd do direct queries, and you'd have to, if someone wanted the freshest data, they'd have to query it again. That changes within Fabric, which is actually a really nice functionality. But this is how you get an overview, and you can see here as well, you can also click and you see where the data is coming from. A further report is from the lakehouse. So if we go into Data Factory, it's a lot more simplified in this version I've done of the like POC or whatever you want to call it, use case. But you probably do this in normal Data Factory as well. But times of since I did that first use case, I've also learned a lot about Fabric, so Fabric or Data Factory. So if we look here, you'll see you have the copy data parts. If I go from source, you can see it's actually going to the API. This one is Coinbase.com. And I put it into Kruge Lakehouse in a table called Bitcoin Lakehouse, for example. That's just grabbing raw data and putting it directly into the Lakehouse. That's all it is. You can actually have this running. I had it running every 2 minutes. So the last time it ran was the 30th, the 11th. We could run it now easily. If I go to, there should be a trigger button somewhere. Run, here we go. I can run that now, and that would run the pipeline to get fresh data in there. So that is it for Data Factory. It's very simplified. I'm not removing any data anymore. I'm just pumping loads into the lakehouse. So every 2 minutes, I was grabbing the freshest data. If we then go back, if I go to here, for example, let's go back out. I want to go to Data Factory, into my workspace. You do get lost in a few clicks sometimes, so navigating it, you really have to use it on a daily basis to get around. But I want to go to my lakehouse. So if I open this up, what I should be able to see is the tables in there. So these are all the tables within my lakehouse. So it puts it into like a table format, because a Parquet format keeps a structure of the data. So it's a very different to like a row-based format like CSV. You actually have Parquet format, which I have a slide about, which I'll show. But what is quite nice is that you can actually see it as a table, which you'd recognize via SQL, like you view a table. You can also view the files. It might take a while to load. So here, it's just a bunch of Parquet files. But if I actually get it to load the actual raw data, hopefully it will. It might take a second to load. What I can do in the meantime is open a new tab while that actually loads. Because I'm using the trial, and I've extended that trial, which you can do 5 times. Should not say that, but I was told that, and I was never told I could not say that. But you can actually have a trial of 60 days, and you can extend that by 5 times. So that's like 300 days of free trial. If I did the maths wrong, I apologize. But I've extended this about 3 times now, so I can actually have this use case running. But you get put down to an F1 capacity, so even lower than an F2, just to actually keep your lights on. So you can see this is still trying to load. Oh, there you go. This one actually did load. I don't know why. This one went faster, but hey-ho. This actually shows like the table structure. But underneath that, as I showed before, it isn't like a normal table you'd see. It's a bunch of files. So it's pretty cool the way that can work. Now that's the lakehouse one. So normally you would have a notebook to go towards a lakehouse, and you run Python or SQL, whatever you want. You have to do SQL within Python or whatever now, and then you can only manipulate the data through the notebook. But you can actually change it to a SQL Analytics endpoint, which if I click properly, it looks very SQL Server-like. So you get tables. You can actually do queries on there, new SQL queries, select top 1000, and I can also generate views. So look, you can see all the whole structure looks very similar. And what I did, I don't want to manipulate the data because I don't need to. The data is coming through in quite a good, clean form, and it's only a small proof of concept. But what I did, I could put some views together to get some more detail of the data. So I wanted to see what the Bitcoin price was 30 minutes ago compared to what it is now. Don't rely on the data that I'm showing because it's old, and if you want to buy Bitcoin, do that on your own accord. Don't trust my report. I'm just doing this as a proof of concept. So, like, terms and conditions apply. But you'll see, and don't rate my SQL skills. This is just a little test case. But you'll see how I've just done over the last 30 minutes, and I'm doing that against Parquet files, which I think is amazing. It's pretty cool that you're just selecting over a bunch of files and not actual SQL Server table. So that's actually, you got the lakehouse. If you did this in a warehouse, you could do the similar thing, but you'd actually be able to manipulate the data. If I try to do it like an update statement here, it won't work. The SQL Analytics endpoint on a lakehouse only allows you to read the data. In a notebook, then you can manipulate the data. It's something to really be aware of. So if you're actually designing this from the ground up, you need to know the differences when you make your decision. I just clicked it together and then figured it out after. Not the best way, but I'm playing around with it, trying to figure it out. So that's it for the lakehouse. If I go back to my workspace, we see the other components in there. So you have the API being called, going into the lakehouse, and you have the SQL Analytics endpoint, which I was using, which I've shown. And then you have the semantic model, which by default, you can pick them up. So those tables, that view, you can also select. So the view, which I did, that like Bitcoin of 30 minutes, that actually gets put into the report. And then I can select in the Power BI report from that model, that view. And then you get something like this in the end, which is pretty cool. So I've got my top 100 of the Bitcoin prices. You can just I can tell you what the difference is in the last 24 hours. That comes straight through. If I had this pipeline running for the last hour, then I'd get the last 30 minutes, and that would be from that view that I showed you. And you get the current price and the prices of all the different ones in the past. So because this ran the last time, 30th, the 11th, if I refresh, it might take a while before it loads because I'm only running a small capacity. But you should get a newer, fresher data in, but we can come back to that. But that's it in a nutshell, showing you actual real use case of pulling data in using only Fabric components, which is really cool. So if we go back to here, there's still some more things. So that's it in a demo, small use case you can see, and quite easy to configure. If I get my clicker working, there's some components I really want to talk about still. One of them is, it's a SaaS product, yes. But that does not mean that disaster recovery or those kind of parts are done for you. You need to enable for it to be like a geo-replicated across for your data. And that's asynchronous. So if there is a failover to another region, and regions do fail, so don't just think, oh yeah, we're in West Europe, we're in North Europe, or so on. If you're a critical company that needs 24/7 uptime, like 365 days a year, this is something you need to consider, because you're then at the mercy of Microsoft, especially if a region goes down. If you don't have a secondary region configured, and also knowing that it's asynchronous, you don't know if the data's in sync, if that's data loss, what are you going to do, what data's been lost. It's something you need to think about and also make a plan for. And on top of that, if there was a disaster, it's not done for you. So they will fail over to a new region, yes. But if you actually go through the documentation, there's a lot of steps in there, and you have to recreate workspaces, recreate different resources, pipelines. You'd have to run the pipelines again to get the data across. The region which is failed goes into a read-only replica. You then have to get all the data across, and that could be quite a lot of data you're trying to move across. So your RTO, RPO, and everything like that, this is very hard to test and very hard to know what you'd actually be expecting from this. So if it was an actual disaster, so something to also note. Okay, and there is a page which I've put on there. So the actual guidance to go through it, and this is something which I loved. If you turn this on, it can take 1 week before it even starts replicating. So once you actually enable the asynchronous, it can take a week before. So if you're already spinning up a production and you're like, yeah, we're ready to go, and then you turn that on, if you have a disaster within that week, you might not be replicating your data. Something to also be aware of. You have to really the small print, whatever you want to call it. Okay. The Parquet format, you'll see down the bottom of the screen, there's Fabric notes. This is from Microsoft itself in their GitHub. You can actually get these notes, and they go through a different part of Fabric in a nice, funky way, a bit more digestible than just reading Microsoft Learn. But it shows you the difference of a CSV file versus a Parquet file. So if you don't know what the hell I've been on about with Parquet, this gives you a bit more of an overview of what the differences is, because a CSV is row-based like format, where Parquet is column-based. And that makes compression better, so you get better performance on the data if you're moving files, because it's compressed more, and also on the read capabilities. That's why they get high performance in Fabric. And it's open source, so it's nice to see Microsoft is adopting open source things like Apache Parquet. Blah, easy for me to say. There's a difference in how the engine is working for Power BI. So as you see on the screen, it'll say Power BI new superpower. When you did SQL queries in the Power BI world, which you still can, it goes through a SQL endpoint. So it has to go to a SQL endpoint, and then will go to your table or whatever it is that you're querying. With Fabric, because it's in a Parquet format, it can skip that step. It can go direct to the actual source. So it actually makes it faster. So you get a lot more performance from the Power BI retrieving the data. So it's not having to go through another step and then get there. So it's quite nice. The Parquet format really changed the way they could actually do the design of this. When I get to the next part, we then have 2 SQL endpoints. This is what I was mentioning earlier, and this goes into a lot more detail and a lot more clearer. You have a lakehouse and a warehouse. It gets very confusing, and I've been dealing with this for months now, so I finally sank into my head the difference. I had to Google it so many times to remind myself, what is the difference? A lakehouse is, for SQL, as I said, read-only, and you can do updates through Spark, so notebooks, etc. It has to go through the Spark cluster. You'd have data flows, etc. if you want ingestion. With warehouse, you have SQL pipelines, data flows as well. With the read-write, the warehouse is where you can do your DDL, DML through SQL. With Lakehouse, you have to use the notebooks, which you can do SQL now in notebooks, but you have to know it's a notebook, not like a query that you do within like normal SQL Server. And it goes through different components. It's something you really need to be aware of. Yes, you can use SQL on a Lakehouse, but don't expect to be able to update the data through it, unless you put it in notebook form, etc. But it makes it very, it makes it different to use. It's not like you can do what I did through the views, or you have a store procedure you'd want to trigger. You have to then have a warehouse if you wanted to you wanted ADF to call a store procedure, which would update the data in a warehouse. That would work, but it wouldn't work for a lakehouse. Another terminology which is new is OneLake. OneLake is just like a glorified storage account. It's the best way I could describe it. And then you have shortcuts, and shortcuts can go, you have the internal shortcuts, external shortcuts. This goes into a better description of what they are. And in OneLake, everything's stored as like a Parquet format when you put it into a lakehouse or a warehouse. And you can use OneLake for further things, so it's like the dumping ground for all your storage. One thing to note, one of the first things I asked towards Microsoft when this was presented, so yes, you have a SaaS solution for a data platform. If all the data is stored in the same place, OneLake, how do you protect the data from, say, someone moving from a production workspace, the data to a dev workspace? If it's under the hood the same, all the networks the same, you don't get like you do with infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. You can have network segmentation. You're the one who designs that. Now this is taken care for you. The answer I got was the separate capacities. Then you really have a segmentation between the two, but an admin can move the data across capacities. That's what I was told. Have I tested it? No. So take that and also just be aware of that, because what I would not like is that you have a production workspace in one capacity and you have DTNA. A user has permissions to all of those environments, but he can move the data or she can move the data as they please. That's not going to fly for a banking situation. You don't want the data of sensitive ones moving around like that, and you don't have control of that. Something to be aware of when it comes to the design of Fabric as well. So I've gone through all different components there of how this is. Please don't try and ingest this now. Take it in your own time of what the information is and let it flow in, because it will take a while before the understanding comes, because there's a lot of components to it. The licensing prices would have changed here because this is an old slide. So, and also they did just change the individual licenses prices for like pro licenses. So do not quote me on these prices. They have changed. I'm not selling it to you right now, so don't look at me for if it's incorrect. I'm telling you it's incorrect. But what is important here at the top, it says a free 60 days trial. That's what I was saying before. So one thing to note, if you do this in a company organization, if you turn this on, you probably turned it on for the whole company. So something to be aware of, that if you do that, that you might have someone saying, what if you just enrolled us to? You can do it on your own setup. You can set up it yourself and do a free 60-day trial. After the 60 days, you can extend it, yes. If you don't actually click extend, normally you get that option within like 5 days to go. If you don't extend it, then Microsoft will start deleting stuff. So it's good. You can just link it up to a Git repository in Azure DevOps or GitHub, whatever you want. You can link it there. GitHub has been in preview, but you can actually connect, like, say, Data Factory to it. So you can save what you've built in case you've done some fancy, cool stuff like I have, and you don't want to lose it. So at least you have it stored somewhere. Other than that, it goes into a bit more information. I mentioned the capacities. I think I said it before, but if you have a pro license or premium license per user, that doesn't change. If you have it for a capacity, then it will change from Power BI capacity. You have to change it to a Fabric capacity. And there's a bit of a difference. When I did one of these presentations for the first time, someone asked me about how it works. So you'll see here the difference with an F2 to an F64, the pricing model. The price here is probably also incorrect, but you get a general idea of the pricing variance. It won't be much different to what it is shown on here. I mentioned the F2 has the same power as an F64. If you want to spend the big bucks, so an I think it's 1024 or the 2048, then you get different hardware, and then you get fancy stuff, and then you really get you get new hardware. It's a lot faster. You get a lot more compute, but you have to really pay the big bucks. So everything else under that, F2 to F64, let's say, is the same performance. Something you should also know, I've heard rumors it may change, but if you want to use AI, you saw I had AI skills. If you were paying a close attention to the demo, that you need an F64. It only currently works with F64. So if you want to link Copilot, which you can through AI, and then into Fabric, you need an F64. That may change, but currently that's the way it is. So you have to pay quite some money. And an F64, oh, well, let's go to the next slide. I'll explain. Is the equivalent, a P1, if you know about premium capacities, a P1 was 8 cores. That's the equivalent to an F64. And this is quite a cool table to show the differences. You can find all this information online on the Microsoft documentation. It's not hard to find, so you'll be able to see the equivalent. If you're wondering how you get to Fabric from like a use case perspective, or you want to go to Fabric from now, from like a PaaS solution to know what size to use, yeah, that's hard. There's no answer for you. You're going to have to get the workload going in like a dev environment in Fabric and testing how a load test would be of what you'd think production would be like, because there's no way of knowing. It's a very different engine under the hood, and it's very different way of setting it up. And I don't think I mentioned this before, and it's something to realize, because we talk about capacities now and the different core components, etc., and F64, blah blah blah. If I mentioned it's not good to have production capacity sharing with dev. And something to note as well, I feel like we've gone back in time. It's talk about SQL Server on-prem. You have an application server running probably IIS or something. You have a SSRS for reporting services. You have SQL Server as a data warehouse. You don't run that on one server. you would have everything fighting for the same CPU, everything fighting for the same memory. SQL Server will try and gobble that up. So if you have one capacity, and you have reporting, data engineering, data ingestion, all that going on one capacity, that's like run server. If you have a F64, yes, you have compute, but you start getting throttled. If you have an F2, it's all on one. You really have to design this in a good way where you actually have shared space for resources. Yes, Microsoft are doing a lot of things fancy, but there's a certain limitation to that. So something to really take note of. And that's why I really say production should be on its own capacity, but you still have to take care of what's going on there, because things will be fighting for resource at one point. And if you get throttled, it's something you need to be notified on. And you can do that, but please take that as a note. Other than that, there's a lot of detail I've gone into, so there's not much more. There's a lot I can probably say, but I could talk about this for weeks. Please reach out if you have any questions. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'll put my LinkedIn on the video, like in the comments. You can find me, reach out if you have any questions. If you think I've said anything incorrectly or you disagree, please also reach out. I'm happy to have to talk to you about it. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I'm always willing to learn and to listen. But I hope you have learned something and I enjoyed it. And if you see me speaking at a conference, please come by, say hello, and yeah, I look forward to meeting you. Okay, thank you for listening, and that was WTF, What the Fabric. Bye-bye.